Hello class, today we're going to take notes on Unit 2, an introduction to a celebration of human achievement, specifically speaking, the English Renaissance. We're actually going back in time a little bit because we've already completed Unit 3, but we're going to go ahead and give this one a shot before Ramadan comes in hopes of being able to finish Hamlet. Now, our essential questions for this section. The first one is, what can drive someone to seek revenge? Most of us, at one time or another, have felt the urge to seek retaliation against someone or something that has harmed either us personally or someone we care about. Revenge is also a major plot element of countless books, movies, and television shows. Clearly, the idea of vengeance is one that appeals to many people. But what factors influence some people to take action while others do not act? And why do people feel the need for revenge in the first place? We're going to discuss this question in particular a lot with Hamlet because the plot of Hamlet is driven by one person's need to take revenge. The second essential question is, how does time affect our feelings? Time heals all wounds, or just sleep on it, you'll feel better in the morning. These are two phrases that you've probably heard or something similar to them many times. The central idea is the same. As time passes, human feelings change. But in what ways? Do feelings fade in strength, or do they become more powerful? Are there cases in which feelings are unaffected by time? Can a strong feeling a person has at one time be transformed into a completely different feeling? Our third essential question is, what is the difference between love and passion? For millennia, writers, poets, artists, and countless others have struggled to define what constitutes true love. Because love takes so many forms and it's expressed differently by each individual, it often blends into and is sometimes confused with other emotions. What is love and what is passion? Why is it so difficult for people to distinguish between the two? Think about some of the Romantic era poets that we've read in the past and how their strong feelings towards a subject are transformed. Now we're going to backstep that a little bit, and we're going to talk about some Shakespearean sonnets, for example, in which the language is much stronger, and instead of talking about nature, which is what Romantic era poetry does, we'll be looking at some poetry that's directed at specific people or things. Our last essential question is, how do you defy expectations? All of us face them every day. The expectations we have for ourselves and others, and the expectations others and society have for us. High expectations for behavior or achievement can lead to soaring success if they are met. But it can easily end in spectacular failure and crippling blows to self-esteem if they're unmet or unrealistic. Low expectations, on the other hand, are all too often become self-fulfilling prophecies. How are we motivated by the expectations that surround us? What happens when someone chooses to go against the expectations that have been put in place for them? Think about how you are extrinsically motivated. What on the outside motivates you? Maybe you're intrinsically motivated, which means your motivation comes from within yourself. Your expectations, this is something that you face, or you are beginning to face as seniors, getting ready to choose what the next step in your life is, right? So I expect us to have some pretty interesting conversations about defying expectations, or maybe not defying them. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the English Renaissance in a nutshell. More or less what we're going to do is go over a brief history of the important parts of the English Renaissance so that when we read the literature, we're familiar with what was going on culturally and historically. So the Renaissance, which literally means rebirth, was marked by a revival of art and learning and the rediscovery of classic Greek and Roman ideas. This is a period of time where a new emphasis is placed on human achievement. Artists, writers, scholars all refocus their efforts on exploring the natural world rather than the spiritual world. In other words, we had a shift from a very religious people, coming from like the plague, for example, to a people that are interested in science. Some Europeans began to question the teaching of the church, which directed Christians to endure suffering while they awaited rewards in heaven. We talked about this a little bit with the Middle Ages, but essentially there were, when we read Chaucer, for example, there were people that would go around proclaiming to be part of the church, and in fact they were part of the church, but they would sell fake relics and promise people salvation to heaven when that's not something that, a main religious belief of Christians is that you can promise somebody. Only God can decide. So people were getting fed up with this principle, like, why are we starving on earth when you eat like kings? And supposedly this is what, we're going to get rewarded in heaven. And so people started to challenge the church. In 1440, a printing press with movable type was created, allowing Renaissance ideas to be printed in mass and distributed to an increasingly literate population. We had mentioned previously that a lot of people couldn't read or write, but in this period, because there's a shift towards more learning, more people are learning how to read and write. The printing press was a really important tool in this because it allowed books to be printed faster. Before this, originally, if you wanted a book, somebody had to literally handwrite it, right? A little bit after that, there's a printing press, a version of it where you made like a stamp for the page and you stamped every single one. But the movable type allowed the text to be changed and you could print more of these books in a shorter period of time. Hence, more publications. Despite the Renaissance beginning in Italy in the 1330s, its influence didn't reach England right away. Mostly because there was some significant political instability until Henry VII took the throne in 1485. When this happened, the Renaissance took off in England, and it didn't slow down for a number of years. Henry VII was the first in a succession of very influential rulers. You might be familiar with Henry VIII or Elizabeth I, for example, all derived from his dynasty. Henry VII negotiated favorable treaties, built up the nation's trading fleet, and financed expeditions to the Americas. He also made an alliance with Spain, which was another very powerful country, by marrying his son to Princess Catherine of Aragon. We mentioned this before, but I want to reiterate, one of the strongest ways during this period, for centuries really, to make alliances with countries was to marry off one of your children to a child from the ruler of that other country. A very famous example of this is Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria had kids when, I believe it was World War I or World War II started. Her children were literally all over the place. It was World War I, now that I think about it. Because she had married to tie alliances. Now, that was more recent, but in this time, those alliances could be the difference between your country thriving for a couple generations and not. And it could also be the difference between your nation or your country fighting in wars and not. At the same time that Henry VII is taking power in England, dissatisfaction with the Roman Catholic Church and its leader, the Pope, spread throughout Europe. The great wealth and power of the church threatened the power of kings, and the church corruption enraged religious reformers. Literally, the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church had so much power that they could threaten and so much money even, they could threaten to pull their funding from a country because of because they weren't being Catholic enough, and that could devastate a country. France is a really good example of this. France had several major financial troubles, and they relied on the church's support in order to stay afloat and to protect their borders from England, because those that support the church would then send soldiers to fight in crusades and everything else, right? So the church played a really large political role, which is not necessarily what it's supposed to do. In 1517, a man by the name of Martin Luther, who's a German monk, responded to this, essentially to this dissatisfaction by writing what's known as the 95 Theses and nailing them to a church door. Him doing this sparked a reformation, a moment of religious reform. So he posted essentially a list of complaints, for lack of a better way to describe that, right, to a church door, which then, because of the printing press, could be published everywhere. So everybody was aware of these complaints, and it allowed a sense of unity that had not existed before. Why is this important? Well, today, you have your smartphone, you open it up, Twitter, Insta, Facebook, whatever you want to use, and you can have people mobilized in a matter of minutes, if not seconds, right? But this is a time period where none of that exists. Even to send a letter to somebody, you have to put somebody on a horse, and, they ride however many hours to get there, or days or whatever. So, and that's without having to think about the time of handwriting those notes, right? Now we can do the printing press. We can print hundreds of thousands of copies at a time. We can send these people off, and the news spreads. Still much slower than today, but this is super new in this time period. Now, following Henry VII, moving on a little bit, we have Henry VIII, who is his son. When Henry VIII took the throne, he at first attempted to remain loyal to the Catholic Church. But he became a little obsessed with producing a male. And his wife, Catherine of Aragon, wasn't doing that for him. In fact, she had only one living child, a girl. And nobody cares about the girls because girls can't rule on their own. So, in order to produce a male heir, Henry proposed an annulment of his marriage. In other words, he wanted to end his marriage. The Pope denied his annulment because the Pope, even for the king, has to approve such requests. In response, Henry VII broke away from the church. He said, "Forget you. I don't need you in my life anymore." And he formed a new church called the Church of England, declaring himself the head of the Church of England, which still exists today. Now, you might be thinking, well, where does he have the authority? Well, that's a really good question. He just decided he was going to do it, and so he did. But many of the rules were similar to that of Catholicism, except he was allowed to get an annulment several times, which we'll talk about later. Henry VIII had a total of 6 different wives, but only fathered one son, Edward VI, who eventually became king, but died at the age of 15. Womp womp. All that trouble, 6 wives, only one son, and he died. What a bummer. Because, even though Edward was the youngest, he took the throne first because he was a boy. But because there were no other heirs but 2 living girls, Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, became queen, and she decided to avenge her mother. She forced the entire country to become Roman Catholic again, and she persecuted anyone that refused, aka the Protestants, the people that were not Catholic. Persecuted meaning she killed. And she killed a lot of people, and she would literally have their heads cut off and hung on the outside of the palace so that people could have a warning, right? For her actions, she earned the nickname Bloody Mary, and she was not a well-loved ruler. I mean, somebody with the name Bloody Mary, not the best nickname in the world, right? But better times were ahead. When Mary died in 1558, her half-sister, the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, Elizabeth, known as Elizabeth I, became queen. By far, she was one of England's most ablest monarchs in English history. Despite never being married, she enjoyed a very long and successful reign. During her time, England enjoyed a time of unprecedented prosperity and international prestige. England became very powerful. They avoided costly wars, ended the Spanish alliance, and encouraged overseas exploration. And in terms of religion, which had caused much turmoil in the country in the previous years with her sister, she practiced tolerance. She decided to go on like a midline path. She wasn't too hard on Protestants because she herself was a Protestant, and she let Roman Catholics do what they wanted to do as well. To each their own was more or less her philosophy. Now, during Elizabeth's reign, William Shakespeare began his career, and several of his plays were performed in her court. Elizabeth I was a huge supporter of Shakespeare. She loved the arts. She was a very large supporter of them. So in this period, we don't just have Shakespeare, we have many playwrights that are coming to the palace, which is something that wasn't very common. And it's also rumored that she once went to Shakespeare's Globe. When Elizabeth died in 1603, the powerful Tudor dynasty came to an end. Because Elizabeth I had never gotten married, she never had any children. So what she ended up doing was she left the throne to her cousin, her second cousin actually, it's her cousin's son, James Stuart, King of Scotland. He became known as James I. Not a very great ruler, actually. We got nothing memorable to say about him, only that he died in 1625, and Charles I, his son, became king. Now, Charles I was a hot mess. In 1629, he dismissed the Puritan-dominated parliament and didn't summon it again for 11 years. So imagine just dismissing your government and not calling them back for 11 years. Now, at the end of those 11 years, when he decided to reconvene Parliament was a little mad, and they stripped him of a lot of his powers, many of his powers. Charles tried to respond with military force, meaning summoning an army and fighting them, which only created a civil war. The English Civil War pitted royalists against Parliament. Under Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan army supporting Parliament defeated the royalists, and King Charles I executed in 1649. Parliament established a commonwealth with Cromwell as its head, but eventually that lost public support because he too became too self-centered, I guess you could say. He became just like another king, and they didn't like that. So what they did in 1660 is a new parliament invited Charles II, Charles I's son, to return from exile as king, marking the beginning of a period known as the Restoration. Restore. The next period was where we're trying to rebuild some semblance of order. Now, why would they invite Charles II back? Well, they invited him back under a lot of stipulations. Like, there were a lot of rules that went along with this. But we will learn about that later. So that wraps up our notes about this period of time, the Renaissance, and it's going to lead us into the first section of notes about, the section of notes about Hamlet, which will be primarily the text that we read throughout this period. All right, see you in the next video.